the atmosphere itself, has it changed with the new government?
It absolutely has. And you can see it when you look at the attitudes of the people. You can see it in the way that they're celebrating, they're expressing their opinions about the new president, about the, sort of celebrating the newfound sense of freedom and liberty in the country. But I suppose for any government, it goes beyond just allowing people to feel free. It's not a small thing by any means, but it goes beyond. I mean, the government's pledges and promises go beyond just that. And as you can see, we're coming out of 5 years of authoritarian rule. We're coming out of a period where we've seen constitution being undermined. We've seen the fundamental rights of people being curtailed every single day. We've seen legislations that are quite draconian coming into practice. For example, the Anti-Defamation Act, the amendments to the Freedom of Assembly Act. So basically, we've seen 5 years of repressive authoritarianism. But I also feel that if you're going to sort of set the benchmark to be better than that government, it's a very low bar. And I think based on the promises, based on the opposition manifesto, based on the promises, and also particularly the remarks after the inauguration by the new president, I think at least for now, the bar is much higher than that. His promises, his pledges go beyond just changing, becoming a little better than the previous government. It talks about anti-corruption. It talks about changing or reverting back to constitutionality. It talks about re-establishing rule of law. And also, one thing that I found very interesting was that he didn't shy away from mentioning the importance of reforming the judiciary. Now, if you remember, the judiciary has always been a controversial issue in this country, particularly because they have so much power. And the fact that he was able to say it point blank that there are problems within the judiciary, that they need to change the judiciary, that they need to reform the judiciary, is an absolute, it was a very blunt admission of the upcoming changes to the government policies and how he's going to try and change the situation in the country.
So like you're saying, these are still the pledges, their promises. They seem promising itself,
yes.
The promises, but there has been some movement. You were mentioning the anti-defection law itself. There has already been some movement to repeal.
Yes, there has been. And for example, you remember last night the president formed 2 commissions, particularly asset recovery and the investigation of murders and disappearances. Particularly, we've seen the intimidation and threats to human rights defenders and journalists. And there have been 2 specific cases of the murder of Yamin Rashid and the abduction of Rilwan. That's been absolutely undermined under the previous government. The police have failed to do their work in investigating the case. They've failed to uphold their duty of providing the public with answers and families with justice by simply dragging their feet with these investigations. So I think it's important to have an independent inquiry into what's happened. And my understanding is that these commissions will, apart from investigating those murders and disappearances, they're also going to be investigating the kind of state inaction in relation to these issues. And then you have the
recommendations
exactly.
What should be corrected.
Yes.
A little bit more for people outside the Maldives about Rilwan's case, about other cases of intimidation that took place in the last 5 years, so that people outside can really understand what was happening.
So Rilwan was he was a journalist, and he was someone who was not afraid to criticize the existing regime. He was outspoken. He was critical of the president. He was critical of the religious fundamentalist groups. He was very critical of how religion was taking over the political spectrum. So basically, one fine day in August in 2014, he just disappeared. He was seen on CCTV camera as he was going to Hulumale, which is the adjacent island, boarding the ferry. But then he just disappeared. And I remember very vividly right after his disappearance, the president was actually asked this question, and he was very dismissive. And it was one of the most disheartening things to see a president of a country be so dismissive about the abduction or disappearance of a journalist particularly. I mean, anyone's disappearance is concerning, but the reason why he was posed that question that particular day, because it was a journalist, and there had been previous intimidation to journalists before as well. So, and you know, from that point onwards, the police have been absolutely unresponsive. I was working at the Human Rights Commission, and we spoke to the Home Minister, the police several times. We wrote to them. We asked about the investigation. We asked about progress in it, but they were just absolutely incompetent, or at least they were deliberately incompetent in investigating that case. It's been almost 5 years to that day, and we've yet not heard any credible information from the police to shed any light on what happened to him. And if you remember, the court case of the people convicted of or accused of the case was held a couple of months ago, and they were acquitted because there was no evidence. The state prosecution was simply incapable of presenting enough evidence to the court. And so, and same with the murder of Yamin Rashid. He was also a blogger and a ardent human rights defender. He was one of the best friends of Rilwan, and he was also an ardent critic of the current administration. He was also very vocally critical about the religious establishments. And on the 27th of April 2017, he was murdered inside his own home. And again, with that as well, the president came up the very next night and said Yamin Rashid was murdered because of the things he wrote. And if you're in a 100% Muslim country, you should be aware that what you write will have implications. So his narrative was sort of defending the murderers, or the people who did it. And we've seen that the police investigations has also been quite, they've flip-flopped on issues, they've not been able to say things coherently. So I think right now this investigation, this commission is crucial, because we've seen government inaction, we've seen impunity, we've seen people leave the country. Say, you know, we've heard that they've gone to fight in Syria, but people who were key suspects in the abduction of Rilwan have left the country with the blessing of the government, with the blessing of people within the government, and this inquiry absolutely needs to find out what happened.
You were talking about this particular case in the judiciary and how people who were accused have been acquitted or are not part of the case anymore. Contrast that with the judiciary, judicial activism, if you can call it that, in terms of politicians being quickly charged, put in jail on terrorism charges, etc. I mean, here you have a citizen who has been murdered.
No, particularly over the last couple of months, since 2000, particularly in 2018 and late 2017, what we've seen is the judicial system being capitalized by the government, and rightfully, as you've mentioned, we've seen murder investigations dragging on for years. We've seen investigations about abductions dragging on for years. We've seen acquittal of people simply because, you know, there was not enough evidence, or because the prosecution failed to fight the case properly. But if you remember the case of several cases, the case of President Nasheed, the case of former Defense Minister Nazim, and many of the cases, particularly some of the political cases, we've seen that they have been sentenced without even affording them the right to defense. I mean, they've just heard the evidence from the prosecution, and the courts determined that, or secret police intelligence, and absolutely. And they decided on the spot that, without hearing evidence from the defendants, they've decided that the evidence from the prosecution is too strong. We don't feel that any evidence from the defendant could actually negate those. So the judicial process, the due process for these people have been taken away, their fundamental right to a fair trial taken away. But and even after that, with regard to some of the Parliament members, I mean, the verdicts have just come in like that. I mean, there's been it's been very quick, it's been very hasty, but the actual cases of murder and abductions and cases that's really been relevant to the public has just been dragged on, as I said, for years, and the outcome has always been that there's not enough evidence to convict the defendants.
Explain this to an outsider who has been keeping a watch on what's happening in Maldives, even if it is from a distance. Does the judiciary go whichever way the wind blows? Now, say we're talking about the politicians and all the imprisonments and cases of terrorism, etc. The moment the government changes, all those people, without any really further evidence or trials, proceedings in court, are all released on bail, etc. What's changed except for the government?
That's one of the things that we've, as part of Transparency Maldives, we've raised concerns about, particularly right after the elections when some of the political prisoners were released. One of the things that we highlighted was that, the change of government, the fact that the judiciary or decisions made by the judiciary somehow changed overnight with the election does not reflect a progressive nature of the judiciary. It reflects once again the pliability of the judicial system in the country, that it can be manipulated by anyone in power. And it also doesn't reflect well with the new government unless they're being transparent about the process. And obviously, for example, if some of those people who were in police remand were actually released by the police, that would have been okay because it's a new government and the Home Ministry, the police did it. But because they were taken to the court and without a review process that the public is aware about, I mean, it is a fact that due process was not followed in their arrest and subsequent convictions. But
they've been consistent in that fact.
Yes, but
in their release,
exactly. But if you want to make something right, you cannot somehow assume that doing it exactly the same way that made it wrong would make it appropriate now. And even if if the releases were politically convenient, it does not do anything to improve the image, the credibility of the judicial system. And for that, there needs to be an absolute overhaul of the system, review of the oversight mechanisms, the review of the competency of the people in it. And so far, as I said, the president has made a commitment to do it. It is there in the manifesto as well, in the process of transitional justice and reforming the judiciary. But it remains to be seen once again how much they're able to do, because if for now there is an absolute control of the judiciary, when you talk about separation of powers, well, hopefully with the new government it is going to be there, but how much will the new government be able to check the unchecked power of the judiciary?
So similarly, in that vein, you would probably also you wouldn't want a witch hunt against anybody in the previous regime. There would be due process that would have to be followed.
Yes. No, absolutely. But one thing we are insisting upon is, yes, due process should be followed, their fundamental rights should be respected, but at the same time, in a bid to appear benevolent, they should not be allowed a free pass. Impunity is what's destroyed this country. And for once, we need to be firm about the fact that if you are corrupt, if you are involved in criminal activities, if you have taken money from the public coffers, if you got rich through illicit enrichment, then you will be held accountable. And the commitments made during the campaign, the commitments in the manifesto clearly are towards that. And one of the things that's been encouraging is that part of the 100-day plan and also part of the plan within a couple of months, as far as the new government is concerned, is a comprehensive asset declaration regime, which is something that we've been calling for. And if that's established, it will go a long way to hold particularly people holding public office responsible and accountable. And there also mention of making illicit enrichment a criminal offence, as well as asset recovery. So as far as the 100-day pledge is concerned, it is quite, we are quite looking forward to how it materializes, how it unfolds. If it does, it absolutely is going to be beneficial for the country. But again, we're talking about politicians, we're talking about a coalition. So any policy implemented by the current president impacts every single one of them. So how well this coalition is going to be cohesive, and how well this, if, for example, you can assume the president is going to be integrous and going to do everything that's good for the country, but how much will the coalition see it that way, or how much will they see it as an inconvenience? And I think the key here is, yes, insisting that the coalition remains strong, but also uphold the principles and not compromise principles simply because the coalition wants to do it.
From the points that you are raising about how do you keep a coalition that's so disparate together yet achieve the goals that you are trying to, lots of questions being raised about the possible conflict of interest in terms of portfolios. Now, civil aviation given to the Jamhuri Party leader's wife, the deputy of the party, has civil aviation, when he is known to have an empire that straddles both these sectors. Now, how do you visualize that panning out?
So I think there's been some concerns raised, particularly about the appointment of the cabinet. There have been public outpouring of certain disappointments in terms of the appointments. And yes, I think one of the things that we actually submitted an anti-corruption, clean governance agenda to the president prior to his swearing-in ceremony. And I think it was encouraging, for one thing, to hear that he had actually included parts of that in his inauguration speech. And one of the things that we mentioned was clean leadership, to allow people, to appoint people into positions of power who don't have allegations of corruption, who don't have conflicts of interest, and who are people with integrity, at least people that have not, lost that integrity in the eyes of the people. And yes, I think one of the key criticisms has been about the appointment of the tourism portfolio and the civil aviation portfolio. And I think, from the outset, yes, it is concerning, but also we also need to be mindful of how he's operating within the coalition. But one of the key things that we've always highlighted is that you cannot compromise that principles. You cannot compromise principles of integrity and anti-corruption. And because we've gone through this process where within the last 4 years, we've seen the biggest corruption scandal in the country emerging from the tourism industry. And so I think it is important that there is that, in terms of even optics, that there is that belief, that conviction amongst the people that the president is not going to repeat what happened with the MMPRC and the scandal relating to the sale of over 50 islands. So I think it's a valid concern, but again, it remains to be seen how that materializes in terms of how they function. But it is very important. And one thing that we've always said, and I think it's said mostly in relation to the judiciary. I mean, justice shouldn't only be done, but it also needs to be seen to be done. Similarly, anti-corruption integrity isn't something that's always just, achieved, but it also needs to be seen to be achieved. And if you have in a cabinet, for example, if the key leader of Jamhuri Party is one of the biggest tourism businessmen, tycoons in the country, is also the Speaker of the Parliament, and if the key portfolios that he has interests in, civil aviation and tourism, goes to him, it is an issue of concern. But then one thing that also needs to be, we need to bear in mind is how will the functioning of the cabinet reflect upon that, and how will the current president put in mechanisms to ensure that that conflict of interest is minimized. I mean, I don't know how he's going to do that, but I would be very interested to see how that materializes in the long run.
Thanks so much for giving us your time, and we'll be keeping a track through you of how this government is performing in the coming days, weeks and months.
Absolutely, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.